Good morning, and thank you all, especially to our very distinguished witnesses, for being here this morning, and as well as to all of those who care so deeply about human rights and are here in the audience. The freedom of religion is the most fundamental and the most elemental of all human rights. It is clearly the first freedom from which all the others flow. It allows each citizen the precious right to follow their conscience peacefully and without fear. It protects the critical part of who we are as human beings to seek, to speak, and to act out our fundamental beliefs. When this freedom is protected, the very well-being of society is enhanced. No government should deny or suppress this essential claim to conscience. The reality is, and the tragic reality is, governments and terrorist groups do restrict the freedom of religion, sometimes in the most brutal and public ways. The freedom of religion today, as it has been for a number of years, is under siege in many places of the world, including and especially in China, which is, of course, the subject of today's hearing. Because religious freedom conditions are deteriorating globally, I recently introduced H.R. 1150, the Frank Wolf International Religious Freedom Act. The bill gives the administration tools to better address religious freedom violations around the world. It is why I'm also fighting to reauthorize the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, or USCIRF, which is a bipartisan and independent advisory group that has done incisive work over the years. USCIRF gives Congress vital recommendations about religious freedom conditions globally and recommendations for actions. Several years ago, during a visit to the United States, Xi Jinping was interviewed by a Chinese reporter on fellowship at U.S. colleges. After the interview, President Xi asked a single question of this reporter who was there, not about his family, not about his studies, not about whether he enjoyed living in the United States. The one question he asked was, why do so many Chinese students studying in the United States become Christian? Why one of the world's most powerful political leaders asked this question may never be known, and the student did not have an answer. But religion was on President Xi's mind that day. Whatever was behind the complex question, religious freedom conditions in China, especially under his watch, have not improved. Quite the opposite. It has been a punishing year for China's diverse religious communities. China continues to rank right up there with Iran, Vietnam, and Saudi Arabia in terms of sheer misery it inflicts on members of its diverse religious communities. This is the verdict of the bipartisan independent U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. It is the verdict of the State Department, if only it would connect with policy, but it is in the human rights reports, and China has been again designated as a country of particular concern, and has been since 1999 for being one of the worst violators in the world of religious freedom. This is also the verdict of human rights organizations. Chinese authorities are frightened by the simple proposition that individuals have the right to live out their beliefs openly and peacefully without fear of intimidation. All we have to do is look at events in the past few weeks to see a coordinate, unnecessary, and often brutal campaign to manage, control, or crush China's many religious communities. It has been a very bad month in China. 2 days ago, a cross on a Christian church was burned near the city of Wenzhou. Over 1,200 crosses, along with 35 church buildings, were demolished since 2014. This was done reportedly because they were too prominent, demonstrating the party's weakness. During the just concluded month of Ramadan, Uyghur Muslim students, teachers, professors, and government employees were deprived of the freedom to fulfill their religious duties. In recent years, officials have shut down religious sites, conducted raids on independent schools, confiscated religious literature, and banned private study of the Quran. A new draft counterterrorism law equates terrorism with, quote, the religious education of minors. The Dalai Lama turns 80 this month, and the Chinese government expanded attempts to undermine his leadership and control the selection of the Tibetan Buddhist leaders. The 273 Tibetan Buddhist monks, nuns, are currently detained. Sadly, the Reverend Tenzin Delig died in prison last week. he was serving a life sentence on politically motivated charges. Beijing also continues its relentless 16-year campaign to absolutely obliterate the Falun Gong, the anniversary which is in each year during July. There are reports of torture, detention, deaths in custody, and allegations based on credible evidence of harvesting of organs. 2 weeks ago, the Chinese Communist Party authorities also launched a massive crackdown on human rights lawyers. The lawyers were accused of being, quote, a criminal gang charged with, quote, creating chaos because they defended the rights of Falun Gong, Uyghurs, Christians, and other persecuted persons in China. Many of the lawyers detained are professing Christians, spurred by their faith to defend the vulnerable and at risk. Senator Rubio and I put out a statement about the arrest of human rights lawyers in China. We called the detentions unjustified and said the roundup of human rights lawyers was an undeniable setback in U.S.-China relations. I would like to add that statement for the record. Without objection, it's so ordered. China actively suppresses the faith of communities. Its massive repression of rights lawyers and the brutal and sometimes deadly ways it deals with prisoners of conscience are a sad and black mark on China's recent history. And it will be remembered by history as brutal, unnecessary, and entirely counterproductive. It is counterproductive because religious restrictions makes China less stable. Repression can exacerbate extremism and cause instability. Religious freedom, according to the Pew Research Center, can be a powerful and effective antidote to religious extremism. It is counterproductive because targeting peaceful religious citizens undermines the legitimacy of the state, because it reminds even non-believers of the state's capricious power. It is counterproductive because religious persecution marginalizes the persecuted, robbing China of their talents, their economic productivity, and their contributions to society. The issue of religious freedom must be addressed by the administration during a planned summit in September. But we must ask whether this summit should even take place. There are many issues in the U.S.-China relationship that need attention, but does President Xi Jinping, given his bold disregard for human rights and his brutal suppression of dissent, does he deserve to get the red carpet treatment in Washington? I'd like to yield to my good friend, Mr. Waltz, for any opening comments.
Well, I thank the Chairman, first of all, for his passion and his lifelong commitment to human rights, and secondly, for holding this important hearing. I'd also like to thank our witnesses. Your courage and activism inspires all of us, and it's that very real part of being human that the Chairman spoke about, the spiritual side of each of us. We understand how important it is. As many of you know, I've spoken about it in this commission many times. I, as a young man, had the opportunity and the privilege to live in Foshan in Guangdong, and have still many acquaintances and part of who I am shaped by those experiences. And just like any nation, the sense of what we want as humans, the opportunity to live our lives as we choose, to worship and believe as we choose is fundamental. And so the Chairman holding this hearing is exactly right. I don't think it's any secret that the statistics and the recent events the Chairman talked about against religious freedom. But I think what most of us know is that again, nations and citizens are not synonymous, but I think, as we both know, the way to strengthen a nation and strengthen that sense of resolve is through respecting the spiritual freedoms and the religious freedoms of their citizens. And I think it's important to have these hearings. Every nation strives towards the more perfect union, and I think it's incumbent upon us as citizens of the world, if you will, to make this case. So the Chairman is exactly right. I'm grateful for him bringing this forward. We're here today to hear from each of you, and I think you should view this commission, the Chairman's passion is evident that this is a place that we understand our responsibility to be a place where we can have the conversation, where we can further those goals, and where we can make the case to the Chinese government that the way to strengthen the nation is to honor those religious freedoms. So, Chairman, I thank you.
Mr. Walsh, thank you very much, and thanks for underscoring this is a truly bipartisan commission, and there's no distance between us. There's lots of other issues where we disagree, not here, and I think it's important that that be conveyed to the Chinese leadership. Randy Hochran.
Thank you, Chairman. I also want to echo my gratitude for the work that each of you have done, fighting for human rights, letting us know how we can work together. And this really is something that's universal for us. We know that if religious freedom is taken away in other places, if people are persecuted for their faith, it very easily can happen here as well. And so we have to be vigilant. We have to be ever watchful of how important this basic freedom is. And so I just, again, want to thank you, all of you, for being here, for the position that you put yourselves in and your families in, to be a strong voice for what is right. And we want to help. So much of this, I'm convinced, as we shine light into some areas that are dark, things change. And so this is a pivotal time. I know with the President's visit coming up, we need, as a Congress and as an administration, to stand up again for people who don't have a voice themselves, and you are speaking up for them, and we need to speak up for them. So thank you. Look forward to learning from you, and Chairman, appreciate, as always, your incredible work on this and other issues as well.
So
with that, I yield back. Thank you.
Commissioner Hochran, for your leadership, and I'm glad you're not in the chair again. You have been presiding over the House many, many days. It's good to have you here. I'd like to now begin with our witnesses, beginning first with Ms. Anastasia Lin, who's a Toronto-based actress. She won the Miss World Canada title in 2015. Since her start in acting at the age of 7, Anastasia has appeared in over 20 films and television productions, and most prominently played lead actress in several Toronto-based films about human rights themes in China. Her work has garnered numerous international awards, including the Mexico International Film Festival's Golden Palm Award and the California's Indie Fest Award of Merit. Along with her acting and participation in pageants, she is also known for her public position against human rights abuses in China, a very brave position. Canadian television reports attributed her victory in the 2015 Miss World pageant in part for her passion for human rights. Anastasia will participate in the 2015 Miss World competition to be held this December in Sanya City in China. We'll then hear from Pastor Bob Fu, who was a leader in the 1989 student democracy movement in Tiananmen Square and later became house church pastor. In 1996, authorities arrested and imprisoned Pastor Fu and his wife for their work. After their release, they escaped to the United States, and in 2002, he founded China Aid Association. China Aid monitors and reports on religious freedom in China and provides a forum for discussion among experts in religion, law, and human rights in China. Pastor Fu is frequently interviewed by media and outlets around the world and has testified previously at U.S. congressional hearings and at hearings around the world. He has also appeared before the European Parliament and the United Nations. Pastor Fu holds a double bachelor's degree from the People's University and the Institute of Foreign Relations and has taught at the Beijing Communist Party School. In the United States, he earned a master's degree from Westminster Theological Seminary and is now working on his PhD. We'll then hear from Ms. Rubio Kadir, who is a prominent human rights advocate and leader of the Uyghur people. She is a mother of 11 children and a former laundress turned millionaire. She spent 6 years in a China prison for standing up to the authoritarian China's government. Before her arrest in 1999, she was a well-known Uyghur businesswoman and at one time among the wealthiest individuals in the People's Republic of China. Ms. Kadir has been actively campaigning for the human rights of the Uyghur people since her release in 2005. She was nominated to receive the Nobel Peace Prize several times since 2006. Despite Chinese government efforts to discredit her, Ms. Kadir remains the pro-democracy Uyghur leader and head of the World Uyghur Congress, which represents the collective interests of the Uyghur people in the world. We'll then hear from Mr. Lozang Gyatso, who is the service chief of the Voice of America's Tibetan service, which broadcasts news and information into Tibet, and is arguably the most influential and trusted source of information for the Tibetan people. Before joining VOA, Mr. Gyatso was a founding director of MeccaGallery.com, a nonprofit group promoting contemporary Tibetan art through exhibitions, publications, and social media. Prior to that, while working as an advertising executive in New York City in the 1980s and 1990s, Mr. Gyatso was a Tibetan community organizer and one of the most prolific graphic designers for projects carried out by groups such as the International Campaign for Tibet, Students for a Free Tibet, and Tibetan Center for Human Rights and Democracy. Thank you for your extraordinary work. I'd like to now turn to Ms. Lin for her testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the Congressional-Executive Commission on China for convening this event. My name is Anastasia Lin. I am a Canadian actress. I will be representing Canada at the 2015 Miss World competition in Sanya, China. At least that is my hope. Recent events leave me worried for my family who are still in China. I campaigned for the title Miss World Canada on a human rights platform. I wanted to speak for those in China who are beaten, burned, electrocuted for holding their beliefs. People in prison who eat rotten food with blister fingers because they dare have conviction. These are not criminals. These are people who believe in truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance. When I was crowned Miss World Canada, my father was very proud of me. But within days, his tone changed. He told me to stop my advocacy or he would sever contact with me. I understand he was visited by the Chinese security agents and forced to say these things to me. I've taken on roles in film and television shows that depict human rights abuses in China. And to prepare, I speak with those who have suffered, including Falun Gong practitioners. In The Bleeding Edge, a film to be released this winter, I played one such woman. She is imprisoned and tortured. In one scene, her family is brought before her, made to kneel and beg her to give up her belief. This is the regime's policy of guilt by association. And this is why my father was threatened by the security forces. Never mind that I am a Canadian citizen, upholding Canadian values on the other side of the world. It's a shock to realize that the man who made you feel safe is in danger. I had to choose between silence and my hope for a better China. And then I remembered, silence helps no one. Silence feeds terror. Practitioners of Falun Gong who have been marginalized, defamed, and vilified in China since 1999 are noble people. Despite the constant threat of arbitrary torture, psychiatric abuse, or death, they are steadfast in their principles. They have always sought peaceful means to resist the persecution and generate awareness. In China today, our traditional values are buried under the moral scars of endless political campaign. Material wealth and the pursuit of self-interest are foremost in people's mind. The courage of Falun Gong practitioners and other dissidents and human rights lawyers are exceptions that give me hope to China's future. And yet, it's these people that suffer the most. People with stories of courage and tragedy, like the father of my fellow Canadian, Paul Lee. The elder, Mr. Lee, is 60 years old and in Chengdu, China, once a highly respected county magistrate. He is now beginning his second 8-year prison sentence. He was a rarity in China, a high official that did not use his position to gain wealth or personal advantage, and instead he followed Falun Gong's teaching of truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance, and sought to be fair in his dealings. Mr. Lee spent his first 8 years in prison for writing essays criticizing the Communist Party's crime, and they tortured him and tried to get him to renounce his belief and embrace atheism, and they made him blind in one eye. He did not give up. After being released, he exposed cases of torture and abuse, and that is why he was again arrested and sentenced to another 8 years this April. This is a story of incredible courage, almost completely ignored by the world's media. And there are millions of such stories. Thousands continue to be sentenced to prison every year, often after show trials. Lawyers who represent Falun Gong practitioners, including those lawyers targeted in the most recent crackdown, have faced disbarment, beating, and imprisonment. The current crackdown on lawyers targets these individuals and come as some 80,000 criminal complaints are filed against the former party leader Jiang Zemin by Falun Gong practitioners. The persecution of Falun Gong is widespread and brutal. In 1998, the Chinese Communist government estimated there were 70 million practitioners of Falun Gong in China. And since the persecution began in 1999, millions have been imprisoned, tortured, and sexually assaulted. Estimates of the murdered range widely because information is scarce, and exposing the persecution, it's punished severely. While we have the names and stories of the some 3,800 practitioners who have been killed in the persecution, multiple independent investigators estimate that tens of thousands have been killed so their vital organs could be harvested and sold for organ transplantation, a lucrative business in China. This is a gruesome and unspeakable crime that has created profit for incentives for those brutal persecutors. The victims didn't do anything wrong. They are people of faith and morality. They are people that any country would be fortunate to have. I would think these are the people of integrity that China so desperately needs nowadays. Mr. Chairman, I hope that together we can gain Chinese people a voice. The hope for a better future lays in the people there gaining the freedom to believe what they want and talk to whoever they want to talk to about whatever they want to talk about. I hope this can happen soon. For myself, this would give me back a father, but for many others, it would save their lives. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Ms. Lin, for your very eloquent and incisive testimony, and done so with such kindness, even towards the persecutors. I'd like to now recognize Bob Fu, and as I do, remind my colleagues, when Frank Wolf and I went and visited China right before the Olympics, we had a human rights agenda, obviously, that we were promoting. We called Bob Fu from the U.S. Embassy van and mentioned that, and it was tongue-in-cheek, that we might go to Tiananmen Square and unfurl a banner that says respect human rights. Within 20 to 25 minutes, our embassy got a phone call from the Chinese embassy, Chinese Foreign Affairs Department, saying that we would be escorted out of the country, arrested, if we proceeded with that. And this was just in a phone call from ourselves to Bob Fu. And maybe the van, maybe the phone call was bugged. And on that trip, Bob had set up for us to meet with a number of house pastors, Christian house pastors. All but one were stopped by the government, and the one man and his family that we met with was arrested afterwards and put through a withering time with the secret police. Again, underscoring just as with the Falun Gong and all the others, and we'll hear from the others momentarily, but the repression based on the best information, as bad as it was then, it's even worse now. Pastor Bob Fu.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, for your unwavering leadership and solidarity with those who are persecuted in China and all over the world. And I also thank the co-chair, Senator Rubio, and thank all the members, Congressman Walz and Congressman Hartgen, who are demonstrating their support, your support, for this honorable cause. This is the third year of President Xi Jinping's administration in China, whose policies and actions have raised increasing alarm and in some cases astonished the international community. Domestically, Mr. Xi has purged his political rivals through a selective anti-corruption campaign and monopolized power within the leadership of the Communist Party, the government, and the military. In foreign policy, Mr. Xi has adopted a dangerous and aggressive agenda challenging existing international law and creating his own when deemed necessary, including the national security law, which is being viewed by many as a pretext for human rights abuses. This antagonistic and arrogant approach to governance over the past 2.5 years has earned Xi the nickname Chairman Mao Jr. or Hitler. In the past 2 years, the human rights and rule of law in China have rapidly deteriorated. The number of dissidents taken into police custody, arrested, and convicted since Xi took power has exceeded the total number that occurred during the 10-year reign of President Hu Jintao and Premier Wen Jiabao. Chinese citizens who peacefully criticize the government or defend the rights of citizens, lawyers who dare to represent so-called sensitive cases without cooperating with the government, and activists who assemble in a peaceful manner, attempt to request the government permission to establish an NGO, or peacefully protest against the government policies or judicial injustice, even to gather for a meal, are subsequently invited to drink tea, summoned for interrogation, detained or arrested, and eventually tried in a corrupted judicial system. And to be sure, the Chinese government has intensified its harassment of NGOs, civil society organizations, law firms representing human rights cases, charitable organizations, and political organizations such as the New Citizen Movement. During the Xi administration, and particularly in the past 18 months, religious freedom abuses have reached a level not seen since the Cultural Revolution. Not only have house churches continued to experience intensifying persecution, but now the government-sanctioned 3 self-churches are being subjected to government-sponsored persecution campaigns. The Chinese government persecution of Tibetan Buddhists, Uyghur Muslims, and Falun Gong practitioners, as my fellow witnesses will have testified, has also increasingly worsened. The Chinese government perceives religious practitioners as being guided, so-called by foreign influence, and has subsequently pursued absolute control over religious communities. And this new so-called national security law just took effect on July 1st, has expanded the management, oversight, and the suppression of religious activity under the guise of so-called national security. So I will talk about religious freedom and human rights and rule of law in China, specifically focus on the forced demolition of churches and crosses in Zhejiang province and ongoing persecution of house church and the treatment of human rights lawyers and human rights defenders in China. And then I will offer some recommendations for the U.S. foreign policy on China. And I want to ask request the chair to agree for both our annual report and my written testimony to be on the record.
Without objection, all of that, and any additional remarks or materials the other witnesses would like to be included will be made part of the record.
Thank you. The forced demolition of church crosses. In the past year, the government of Zhejiang province has demolished churches and crosses under the pretext of implementing standards for buildings. And initially, people thought it was maybe just a local and for eradicating of some maybe building based on the building codes. But up until today, we have documented over 1,500 1,500 churches with their crosses are forcibly being removed. And a number of pastors and believers had been beaten up, and some pastors are even sentenced to criminal imprisonment for defending the crosses. According to the information we have collected, at least besides the government-sanctioned churches, which has more than 1,500. With their crosses being removed by force, or some of their churches, the whole building were totally destroyed. At least 50 other house churches in rural areas were also destroyed, or their crosses were forcefully removed. And I think we have a few photos. If you could show these photos. Yeah, you can tell from some of the churches are being demolished as late as yesterday morning, and even the crosses were even burnt from the top of the church building. And just in the a few. Actually, yesterday there's a large church had been the cross were being forcibly removed, and this morning more than 44 churches had issued joint declaration, basically denouncing the government, their evil act of forceful removal of crosses, and made a commitment to defend their crosses from being removed. A number of Chinese human rights lawyers were also called to help those churches. And so some of the lawyers are still at the Zhejiang province. And this morning, according to a BBC report, there are a few hundred churches in Zhejiang, in Guangdong province, have received official notice to be shut down. So apparently this campaign has already expanded into the Guangdong province. And also happened this morning. Honorable member of the committee. This in Guangzhou city, a church called Guangfu Church was raided by 50 public security officers. The pastor's wife and 3 other senior leaders of the church were taken into custody. So this kind of barbaric act of just demolishing churches and destroy a peaceful, symbol of Christian faith, not only to the Protestant churches but to Catholic churches as well, demands warrant a unanimous condemnation by the international community, and notably, even the government, the Chinese Catholic Patriotic Association of Zhejiang, and the Chinese Catholic Bishops of Conference of Zhejiang, and the Chinese Christian Council all sent official letters to the government agencies protesting and basically denouncing this barbaric act, and urge the government to stop this kind of destruction. This is unprecedented, of course, a rebuke from those government-controlled religious institutions. And it certainly reflects the millions of believers' mindset that I think it could trigger more unrest, as contrary to the communist government intention. And of course, the persecution against the house churches with a secret document in 2011, we obtained that mandate to eradicate the whole house churches within 10 years. In the past 18 months, we have seen continuing systematic campaign. The increase both the number of the persecution of the house churches and also the number of arrests had been dramatically worsened. So in reviewing religious freedom abuses perpetrated against the house church during both the 2014 and 2015 this year, the following characteristics emerge. The abuse of administrative penalties and regulations regarding the length of administrative or criminal detention of church members and leaders, persecuting churches and church members under the guise of so-called eradicating cults, and confiscating house church possessions, religious materials, including Bibles and the other scriptures, and banning and harassing Sunday schools, and even the church managed kind of like kindergartens, like in Guangxi province, 4 leaders of the kindergarten teachers were sentenced to a criminal sentence this year for just teaching the children about character building. That's it. They received 2 years to 3 years criminal sentence just for managing that kindergarten schools. And as the chairman just mentioned, since July 10th, the government initiated this sudden campaign against the human rights lawyers. This happened despite of the number of arrests against other prominent human rights lawyers, including Pu Zhiqiang, including the NGO leader Guo Yushan, including the human rights lawyer Xu Zhiyong, and He Zhenjun, including, of course, the human rights defender and journalist 71-year-old Ms. Gao Yu. And this new wave of attack against the human rights lawyers and human rights defenders really prove that the Xi Jinping administration has no intention at all to obey its own law, and let alone the international law. And these human rights defenders, they courageously not only defend for the abuses of the house churches and the Catholic churches, but also they are the defenders for Falun Gong practitioners and the political dissidents and Tibetan persecuted Muslims and human rights advocates. So they're labeled as a subversion, or some are called the causing trouble. And I give you another example that happened in March 2014 last year, and when a group of human rights lawyers, Tang Jitian, Jin Tianyong, Wang Cheng, Zhang Junji, and non-family members of their clients, who is a Falun Gong practitioner, in the Jiansanjiang, in Heilongjiang province, when they just visit there, try to just to ask the whereabouts of their clients. All these human rights defenders and the family members were detained and were abused physically, and the 4 detained human rights lawyers were beaten and tortured, resulting in collectively having 24 of the ribs broken. And some of them are still kind of receiving medical treatment. And so this is just one of the incidents happened in the past year. And this morning, the chairman, Smith, there is a case in Guangzhou involve 3 bold human rights defenders. They are a Christian human rights lawyer, Tang Jingling and Yuan Xinting and Wang Qingying, they're human rights defenders. So for simply holding a banner in front of a government building, demand for freedom of speech, this morning their trial just started, and several of their lawyers had been arrested, including the lawyer Sui Muqing, who is one of the victim of this July 10th raid. So as of this morning, we learned at least over 246 human rights lawyers and advocates and legal professionals have either been interrogated, detained, or have gone missing into police custody, of which 11 human rights lawyers and 3 human rights advocates have been criminally detained, and 6 remain missing. And I received a note from one of the missing human rights lawyers with whom Congressman Smith has met, attorney Li Heping, and his wife just sent a note this morning and saying that she had to send off her 13-year-old son to her hometown in a rural area away from Beijing. And she basically said, this 13-year-old boy witnessing on July 10th when her home were raided, and his father, attorney Li Heping, was taken away in front of this 13-year-old, and with their another little girl. So she said, sending, despite her reluctance to send her son away, and she just prayed that being in the rural area, maybe that could protect their 13-year-old son from being further harassed. And the 16-year-old son of the other 2 human rights lawyers, lawyer Miss Wang Yu and her husband, attorney Bao Longjun, and their 16-year-old son, Bao Mengmeng, on July 9th, he was just on the way to go to study in Australia. Then after the public security officers abruptly just kidnapped his father and also this 16-year-old son, boy, and separate them and put him in detention for 48 hours. And now, today, he was even kind of forced this boy move from Tianjin City, that's his hometown, to Inner Mongolia. And he was already summoned for 3 times for interrogation. I have a 16-year-old daughter. Actually, I brought her with me today, and as a father, how do you feel that that when you are together and suddenly that a group of strangers by force and grab the father away, and for already 11 days, nobody knows where the father or the mother is being detained, and their lawyers are not able to find anything. So this new wave of campaign once again shows that is almost the government became part of like a mafia style to arbitrarily forced disappearance and kidnap these human rights lawyers, and they are the backbone of the China's rule of law, and they are the defenders, and they should be rewarded for their action, as Chairman Smith made the statement, on July 10th, right after this happened. So I want to make a few recommendations finally.
Could we get back to that after we get through all the other?
Yeah.
Just in the interest of time.
Yeah.
Marco Rubio will be here momentarily, and I'm sure he'll want to hear those
Thank you.
recommendations.
Yeah,
So
we'd
I'd like to now yield and recognize Rabia Kadir.
Rahmet, Chairman Chris Smith efendim ve barlıq kongresla. Bugün Devlet Meclisi de Uygurlarının kişilik hukuku ve dini erkinliği için sözleş prohibiting'leri.
I would like to express my deep appreciation to Congressman Smith for the invitation to speak today here. And it's my honor to discuss religious persecution of the Uyghur people in China.
Hazır Xitay hükümeti bizni dini erkinlikten, dinimizden, İslam dinine itiqat qılğanlığımız için muşundan faydalanıp, keng kölemde bastırıp, keng kölemde bir tutkun qılıp, qattiq ahvalda turvatqa vaqtimiz.
The situation of the Uyghur Muslims is not getting any better because of our strong belief in Islam, and the Chinese government's repression is only getting worse.
Muşundaq bir paytda bizni Devlet Meclisi'nin işide sözləş prohibiting'lərə, Xitay komitetiga və sizlərə rəhmət. Bugün mən vaxt itibarı bilən özümün yardımçım Alim Seyitibə həmin gəplərimni sözləb verişini və oxub verişini tavsiyə qıldım.
So I believe the hearing is very timely to discuss the religious persecution of all groups represented here today. And to save time, I'll have my Special Assistant Alim Seyitib to read my written statement. I'm very honored to be here today, and I wish to express my profound appreciation to Representative Chris Smith and Senator Marco Rubio for inviting me to testify today. I also want to thank other CECC commissioners for their strong support of religious freedom in China. The Uyghur people perceive their belief in Islam not only as a personal expression of faith, but also as a statement of their cultural distinctiveness from China's mainstream communist, atheist, and materialistic culture. For many Uyghurs, the incursion of the Chinese state into this private aspect of their lives and the role it plays in establishing a broader new identity for them is viewed as part of China's assimilative process or a form of cultural genocide. In East Turkestan, the twofold implementation of strict national and regional regulations concerning religious belief and practice mean the Uyghur people are subject to the harshest conditions governing religious life in China. This occurs even though China's domestic laws, such as the Constitution and the Regional Ethnic Autonomy Law, guarantee religious freedom. Rather than simply forbid religious practice of the Uyghur people, Chinese authorities have implemented regulations that progressively narrow the definition of lawful activity. As a result, many Uyghurs often discover traditional, normal religious customs are increasingly not permitted. However, Chinese officials justify many of the restrictions through claims that outlawed practices have been imported from overseas, and that it faces an organized threat to public security in the form of the three evil forces of terrorism, separatism, and religious extremism. China's highly politicized criminal legal system, as well as the state apparatus governing and monitoring religion, have ensured the government is the ultimate arbiter in the interpretation of religious affairs. In effect, the bodies established by the Chinese state to oversee administration in China do little to protect religious believers, but assist the government's repression of religious freedom by helping to formulate and promote restrictive regulations. Uyghur religious leaders, such as imams, are required to attend annual political indoctrination classes to ensure compliance with Chinese Communist Party's regulations and policies. Only state-approved versions of the Quran, the Holy Book of Islam, and the sermons are permitted, with all unapproved religious texts treated as illegal publications, liable to confiscation and criminal charges against whoever was found in possession of them. Any outward expression of faith in government workplaces, hospitals, and some private businesses, such as men wearing beards or women wearing headscarves, is forbidden. No state employees or no one under the age of 18 can enter a mosque, a measure not in force in the rest of China. Organized private religious education is proscribed, and the facilitators of private classes in Islam are frequently charged with conducting illegal religious activities. And students, teachers, government workers are prohibited from fasting during Ramadan, the holy month of Islam. In addition, Uyghurs are not permitted to undertake Hajj, which is pilgrimage, unless it's with an expensive official government tour, in which state officials carefully vet Uyghur applicants. Uyghurs found to have contravened religious regulations are punished severely. In a disturbing number of cases, Uyghurs have been given long prison sentences for illegal religious activities, for actions considered normal by international human rights standards. In East Turkestan today, police can stop any Uyghur at any time and to check their mobile phones for religious content. And if the police deem such religious content as illegal, the Uyghur can be arrested on the spot. An area of considerable concern is also the open discrimination against Uyghur religious believers, especially women who choose to lead religious lives publicly. In the 2015 restrictions placed on Uyghurs' ability to observe the Ramadan fast were widely reported. As detailed by the overseas media, government work units outright denied Uyghurs the right to follow their religious customs. For example, middle schools in Bertala, Tarbagatai, and Tumshuk informed their employees and students that they were not permitted to fast. In Jing County, restaurant owners were mandated by the local Food and Drug Administration to remain open during fasting hours, and some were even forced to sell alcohol and tobacco products, which were against their religious faith. Reports also surfaced on social media that Uyghurs were being compelled to eat watermelon in public to demonstrate non-observance of the fast. Although these reports remain unconfirmed, they are consistent with numerous accounts I have heard from Uyghurs, particularly students, who are required to drink water at school in front of their teachers to prove they are not fasting, but rather they are following school and local government regulations. Ramadan in 2015 was particularly tense and harsh for the Uyghur people. In an article dated June 24, 2015, Radio Free Asia described how government workers were being put on alert prior to the holy month. The report was an alarming indication of the suspicion with which the state views Uyghurs who continue with their religious practices. Furthermore, according to Radio Free Asia, one county issued guidelines calling for the intrusive searches of convenience stores, repair shops, and mosques. These restrictions create an atmosphere of distrust and fear. However, 2015 witnessed provocations against the Islamic faith previously not seen. Reports that the beer drinking festival had been organized in Nia, a predominantly Uyghur settlement, on the eve of the Ramadan was a humiliation of the Islamic faith and an attack on Uyghur people's belief. A report published by Human Rights Watch in 2005 described the close relationship between the Uyghur identity and Islam. The authors of the report accurately state Islam is perceived as fading Uyghur ethnic identity, and so the subordination of Islam to the state is used as a means to ensure the subordination of the Uyghur people as well. A report issued by the Uyghur Human Rights Project in 2013 found a sharp deterioration in Uyghur religious rights in the period following 2005. Since the publication of the UHRP report in April 2013, the evidence of China's denial of Uyghurs' right to freedom of religion has not abated. The increased repression of religious practices and belief underway corresponds with Chinese President Xi Jinping's determination to implement a major strategic shift in East Turkestan that prioritizes security policies in the region. State rhetoric regarding the tightening of security is often accompanied by crackdowns on the so-called three evil forces, which frequently target peaceful religious expression of the Uyghur people. A trip to East Turkestan by Xi Jinping, concluded on April 30, 2014, reinforced the call for enhanced security measures. Xi visited People's Liberation Army soldiers and the People's Army Police in Kashgar, a Uyghur majority city that he claimed was the front line of counterterrorism. Radio Free Asia reported a series of cases involving limits placed on Uyghur religious expression across East Turkestan in 2013 and 2014, including Balaksu near Kashgar in May 2013, Beshtugman in Igerch near Aksu city in May 2013, Ushturpan in Aksu prefecture in August 2013, Shehanz in November 2013, Turpan in April 2014, and in April 2014, the fourth extension to an original 12-year jail term handed down to Uyghur religious leader Abdulkerem Abduveli. In an extraordinary move, the harshness of the religious policies prompted by Uyghur delegate to China's People's Consultative Conference to speak out during a March 2014 session. Further sign that regulations governing religion hardened since Xi's announcement is an April 14, 2014 notice issued by the Chinese Communist Party Committee of Hartal Bazar in Aksu city regarding the holding of an unlawful funeral ceremony for Chinese Uyghur cadre Nurdin Turi, a loyal party official distinguished actually by the state. The notes widely circulate on social media states that as Nurdin Turi's funeral was held at the mosque and not at his home, his family was in contravention of regulations on funerals for individuals holding Turi's status. As a consequence of the infraction, the funeral fees normally paid by the state to such individuals were rescinded. 6 months of benefits for the family was withheld. Customarily, the state used to permit Islamic burials for any Uyghur he wished to have one in the past. Prior to Ramadan 2015, reports surfaced of the harsh sentencing of a Uyghur man from Kashgar to 6 years in jail because he had grown a beard in accordance with his religious beliefs. The man's wife was handed a 2-year sentence for veiling herself. The ban on Islamic veiling in Urumqi in 2015 was described by scholars James Leibold and Timothy Gross as a sign of deepening rift of mistrust between the Uyghurs and the Han-dominated Communist Party. Universal religious freedom is protected under the Article 18 of the normative human rights standards outlined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Other international instruments whose standards China is obliged to meet also ensure the right of the religious freedom, such as the Convention on the Right of Child and the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. China's domestic laws, such as the Constitution and the Regional Ethnic Autonomy Law, have strong provisions on freedom of religious belief. Despite the international and domestic legal framework, restrictions on religious freedom are deemed lawful by Chinese authorities through the strict implementation of regulations that contradict China's own laws and international obligations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kadir, for your testimony and leadership. Mr. Gyatso.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. Thank you, the Commission, for inviting me. I'd just like to clarify that I'm not a practicing activist. I'm here as an engaged Tibetan, as Service Chief of Voice of America's Tibetan Language Service. I'm here to provide a sense of what's happening in Tibet today and to put it in context of Chinese policies and actions in Tibet over the last 50, 60 years. I would like to, if I may, Chairman, acknowledge the presence in the room of Speaker Pembertsering. I'm sorry, he left. Never mind. I have 4 images to show you. It'll be in the first 2 or 3 minutes. And as I hold them up, it'll be a signal for you to view it on the screen. And only 4 images. Since problems facing religion, religious institutions, and religious teachers in Tibet is widely known and well documented by this commission and many other governmental and non-governmental organizations in the US and abroad, I won't take up too much of your time going over examples. I would like to, however, touch on 2 events that took place this month, which may serve to highlight the degree to which the Chinese Communist Party is willing to carry out actions that cause enormous suffering for Tibetans and that create an environment of oppression in monasteries and in the personal lives of Tibetans that have triggered the self-immolation protests by over 140 Tibetans since 2009. The latest such protest took place in the afternoon of July 9th, last week, 2 weeks ago. A young monk named Sonam Topgyal set himself on fire at a public square in Kigodo, the prefectural capital of what China today refers to as the Yulshu Tibetan Autonomous Prefecture in Qinghai Province. Photos and videos showing Sonam Topgyal on the ground in flames have emerged since then, and once again, as in many previous cases, Sonam Topgyal was taken from the site by Chinese security and is believed to have died in a hospital. A note he wrote 1 week earlier has surfaced, and in it he says, "I am a 27-year-old son of Teshitsang of Nangchen, Yushu in Tsongun region." He refers to his hometown and the region in the traditional Tibetan geographic designation. "Currently, I am a monk studying in Dzongsar Institute. As people within the country and outside are aware, the Chinese government does not look at the true and real situation of the minorities, but practices only harsh and repressive policies on them. At a time when the government is carrying out policies to stamp out our religion, tradition, and culture and destroy our natural environment, there is absolutely no freedom of expression for the people, and there is no channel to appeal our situation." The other development this month, which has been particularly difficult for Tibetans, is the prison death of a widely respected Lama and political prisoner on July 12th, 11 days ago. Tenzing Delek Rinpoche's family and monastic community had not been allowed to see him since 2013. And were not allowed to see him on the day that Chinese authorities claim he died of a heart attack, nor for several more days as they pleaded to have his body returned to them in order to conduct a funeral fitting for a High Lama. Tibetans pleading for the return of his body were beaten severely by security forces on July 13, 10 days ago, in Nakchu County, Sichuan. Several days after the announcement of his death, his family and some monks were allowed to see his body in the detention center, where he was incinerated in the prison crematorium against their wishes. The Chinese have been in Tibet since 1951, long enough to understand that a prison cremation for a highly regarded spiritual teacher will be seen by Tibetans as a humiliating and degrading act, and therefore understand it to be an added punishment for those who had been pleading his innocence for 13 years. And then pleading for his remains after his death. Further troubling is the fact that his sister and niece have gone missing since July 17th. A relative of Rinpoche in exile that VOA interviewed suspected that the 2 women had been detained for possibly persisting in demanding a proper investigation into his sudden death. On July 14th, 9 days ago, House members at a hearing on Tibet by the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission had urged the Chinese authorities to return the body of Tenzing Delek Rinpoche to his family members. And as far back as 2004, the US Senate passed a resolution by unanimous consent calling for Rinpoche's release. Both calls have gone unheeded. Tenzing Delek Rinpoche's story is neither unique nor rare when you look back over the last 6 decades of Chinese rule of Tibet. Today, there are many known and probably many, many more unknown Tibetans languishing in China's prisons for simply expressing their dissent with the oppressive rules and regulations governing Tibetan lives and the institutions and figures of Tibetan Buddhism. Writers and artists are imprisoned for simply writing or singing about their love of Tibetans' mountains and lakes, culture and history. Many more are detained for refusing to denounce their religious heads, such as the Dalai Lama, during re-education campaigns at temples and monasteries. All of the above seemingly innocuous acts can today be categorized as separatist acts according to recent regulations targeting Tibetans. And once in prison, the Tibetans are accused of acting at the instigation of the Dalai Lama and or foreign anti-China forces, by which most Tibetans understand the Chinese to mean the United States, and are then subjected to torture and prolonged mistreatment with the sole purpose of extracting confessions that correspond to the accusations. This process, repeated across Tibet for 50 years, has created immeasurable suffering for the Tibetan people and deeply disturbed their psychological well-being for decades. As I mentioned earlier, the Chinese government's attack on religion and religious institutions and figures in Tibet is not a recent development, nor are they random aberrations in their rule of Tibet since 1951. The Chinese Communist Party has been purposefully and methodically working to dismantle the very fabric of Tibetan spirituality and religious tradition since 1955. Between 1955 and 1968, almost every single religious institution in Tibet, estimated to number over 6,000 monasteries and temples, many going back 1,000 years, 500 years, had been aerial bombed, artillery shelled, and razed to the ground. Tens of thousands of lamas, religious teachers, monks, and nuns were imprisoned, executed, or disrobed. Public humiliation and torturing of respected reincarnated lamas, often to death, took place across Tibet in the 1950s and 60s in order to ridicule religion and to prove that religious figures were powerless. Attacks on religion during that period was the reason why all of the heads of the major schools of Tibetan Buddhism, all 5 heads, went into exile in 1959 before the fall of the Tibetan government and remained there to this day. The highest ranking Lama remaining inside Tibet in 1959 was the Pension Lama, who spent 13 years in solitary prison for speaking against what the Chinese had done in Tibet up to 1961. After his sudden death in 1989, the Chinese installed their own choice of the predecessor's reincarnation, a child whose parents are party members, Chinese Communist Party members. The child that was selected by monks in the Pension Lama's own monastery and approved by the Dalai Lama as is customary was disappeared along with his entire family in May 1995 and has not been heard of since then. In 2007, China's State Administration for Religious Affairs introduced measures that dictate Tibetan religious figures may or may not reincarnate, and the requirement for the approval of selected reincarnated lamas by officers under the Communist Party. While this may appear simply surreal and bizarre to most people, there are 2 very serious possible consequences from these measures. One that will even further diminish human rights in Tibet, and the other that will impact the state of religious institutions and the very existence of religious practice as we know it in Tibet. Firstly, since nearly all expressions critical of conditions in Tibet and or in praise of aspects of Tibetan culture and identity can be categorized as separatist activities and are punishable acts today, the following sentence in the measure, living Buddha's reincarnations should respect and protect the principles of the unification of the state, would mean that all officially sanctioned reincarnated lamas and the religious institutions affiliated with them would be forced into silence on issues relating to human rights and the state of religious and cultural freedoms in Tibet. And secondly, and this may be not fully appreciated by many people at present, the interference by the Communist Party in the selection or deselection of reincarnate spiritual masters undermines Tibetan Buddhism at its most fundamental level by aiming to break the trust and faith that Tibetans have invested in their lamas for hundreds of years. Tibetan Buddhist practice, based on ancient Indian traditions, holds at its very core the sacred relationship between religious teachers with a pure and direct spiritual lineages, many that go back 1,000 years, and the student practitioners who take vows, initiations, and meditation instructions from them. The successful guidance through complex psychological states and through layers of consciousness in the course of a person's spiritual practice relies completely on this connection between trusted and respected reincarnated lamas and their followers. The measures to control reincarnated lamas is therefore aimed at this bedrock of Tibetan religious practice and could lead to the destruction of thousands of unbroken spiritual lineages of the lamas and to the eventual demise of Tibetan Buddhism as it has been practiced since the 13th century when the reincarnation system was initiated in Tibet. As an example, and on a much more mundane level, it's as if a government decided that it would select people to practice medicine, surgery, and psychiatry based not on their qualifications and background, but on their political leaning. You can imagine what this would do to the state of healthcare. These are just a few examples of how persecution of religion and religious institutions and figures in Tibet are an ongoing feature of Chinese rule of Tibet, and they are posing existential challenges for Tibetans in maintaining intellectual rigor and spiritual vitality in the monasteries and temples across Tibet. The Dalai Lama says in his autobiography that in one of his meetings with Chairman Mao in 1954, Mao turned to him, leaned forward, and said, "Religion is poison." That view appears to have been and continues to be the guiding principle of Chinese rule in Tibet. While its policies since 1955 have gone from destroying religion completely to today, where a small number of monitored monasteries and controlled religious figures are allowed to exist as a show of the government's tolerance for religion and as tourist attractions, while in reality, the monastic institutions and the system of reincarnated lamas is being controlled and used purely for the perpetuation of China's control of Tibet. Thank you, Jan.
Mr. Gyatso, thank you very much for your very comprehensive and incisive testimony. We're joined by Senator Marco Rubio, who was in and probably has to go back to a hearing that's on the Iran nuclear deal as a member of the Foreign Relations Committee, a leader on that committee. Secretary Kerry is testifying, but I'd like to yield to my good friend and colleague.
I just want to thank you, and I want to thank all of you for being here on this important hearing. I don't have an extensive statement. Are we going to go into the question period? Or, yeah, I just wanted to make a couple points. I mean, we've all watched over the. Oops. Are we okay over there? All right. Well, we've all watched over the last 2 weeks as the Chinese Communist Party and its authorities have launched an unprecedented crackdown on human rights lawyers, on activists, the most severe since the legal system was reestablished after the Cultural Revolution. To date, there's been over, that we know of, 200 people detained, questioned, reported missing. So I think this hearing today is timely, and in particular, the focus on religious liberties, which there seems to be an amped-up effort to target those, whether it's the extensive cross removal campaign resulting in the destruction of hundreds of Chinese crosses, the Thai authorities forcibly repatriating Muslims back to China, Tibetan Buddhists who've continued to set themselves on fire in desperation at the abuses of their people. Of course, it goes on and on. And so I think this is an important opportunity to shed light on this extraordinary development that's going on in China that the world seems largely either unaware of or uninterested in. Given all the other challenges that exist on this planet, I think it's one we need to continue to focus on and ensure that this country's foreign policy is one deeply and firmly anchored in moral clarity and human rights. So thank you for the opportunity to be with part of this here today, and I look forward to hearing from our witnesses. And I apologize if I have to leave a few minutes early. We are in the middle of that hearing. It's the only chance we'll have to talk to Secretary Liu, Secretary Kerry, and Moniz on an important issue as well. But again, I wanted to come by for a few minutes and hopefully be able to ask some questions. I'd love to, if I can go for, I appreciate your indulgence in that regard. So, Mr. Gyatso, I want to begin with you. Do you think that a Chinese appointed Dalai Lama is something that Tibetans would ever accept or eventually get used to? I think the microphone, please.
Thank you for that question. It's an extremely difficult and delicate subject for Tibetans. I think the clearest answer I can provide would be that there is actually an existing example of an imposition of an important Lama inside Tibet, the Pension Lama. The Pension Lama, as I mentioned earlier, this current Pension Lama that is sitting in his position was imposed by the Chinese in 1996. The Pension Lama that was recognized by his own monastery and, as is customary, approved by the Dalai Lama, has been disappeared since 1996 to this day. And the Chinese appointed Pension Lama has not received acceptance at all across Tibet. He has had trouble finding proper religious teachers willing to accept that role. He's had problems having monasteries that are willing to have him study in the institutions. And almost every aspect of his public appearances in Tibet have to be orchestrated and choreographed with people bussed to greet him, etc. So I think that gives you a very small indication, although he's a Lama of a smaller scope than the Dalai Lama, that acceptance of a Chinese appointed Dalai Lama is not a viable option.
And Mr. Fu, I wanted to ask you, what policy recommendations do you have for the United States Congress, for the executive branch, in terms of protecting religious freedom in China? And how should the United States government convey those concerns to Chinese officials in these high-level bilateral meetings?
Thank you, Senator Rubio. Yes, I think the how part, at least I can give a few recommendations. First of all, I think given the fruitless of the years of U.S.-China human rights dialogue with China, I think I would really recommend the administration to stop, to cancel this kind of really useless, toothless human rights dialogue. And I would also recommend the human rights should play a more central role instead during the annual U.S.-China strategic and economic dialogue instead, and including a review mechanism to ensure progress on human rights is made during each year's meeting. And I also would urge Congress, both the House and Senate, to seriously pass this Global Magnitsky Act and the other Human Rights Protection Act sponsored by Congressman Smith. And I think that the mechanism, if passed by the Congress, for the Global Magnitsky Acts would really give the true teeth, to ensure at least partially those human rights abusers would be more hesitant to make further persecution. And for instance, the latest campaign against the human rights lawyers, and the Chinese government even admitted the central figure who orchestrated or led this campaign is Minister Guo Shengquan. He is the Minister of Public Security, and he is contribute to this increasing crackdown, like the crackdown and forced removal of crosses in Zhejiang province. The party secretary of Zhejiang, Mr. Xia Baolong, and who has been the leading force for these latest abuses, although with the authorization and approval from President Xi Jinping. This Mr. Xia Baolong and Mr. Guo Shengquan should clearly be put on the list in the State Department for the travel ban, for really, to banning them to travel to America, and we can coordinate with the European allies to ban them as well. So these are some of the key recommendations I would do.
And Ms. Lin, I wanted to ask you, you've documented, this has happened to you as well, how the Chinese government often uses China-based family members of Chinese rights activists as leverage to get them to stop their work. Can you describe a little bit about, I mean, you've written about it before, but how, is that an ongoing practice, and how many people have you met that are affected by it, the idea that they use your relatives back in China as leverage against you to prevent you or hopefully to convince you? Because I think it's amazing, and it'll be shocking to a lot of Americans to know there are people living in this country, perhaps American citizens, who are being extorted and or blackmailed through the safety or security of their own relatives back in China.
I would say that this is a common experience of many Chinese overseas, including Chinese Canadians, Chinese Americans. It's almost like a consensus or like a common sense that the Chinese consulate would send people to watch over to Chinese, overseas Chinese. So religious freedom and human rights doesn't really just affect people that are living in China. They affect every Chinese who still have loved ones there. I don't know how it feels like to be tortured by prison guard, but now I know the deep fear that probably felt by many Chinese people, that their convictions might be paid by their loved ones. But if we keep silence, there's no end to this kind of compromise. Chinese people overseas needs to stand up and speak about this issue. Yes, we might be afraid, but courage is not always the absence of fear. To be courageous, I think I learned from these Falun Gong practitioners that to be courageous is to know that something else is much more important than fear. To be able to live according to your conscience, for them, it outweighs the fear of death. So, and that is why I'm going back to China. I hope my presence in that country would help those who are facing this unspeakable horror that we just mentioned today, to help to preserve their hope a little longer. Thank you.
Thank you. At my request, I would like to ask that Senator Rubio will suspend for about 2 minutes, if you wouldn't mind saying hello to all the, because I know you couldn't get here because of the hearing, and you're going back to the Iranian hearing. I'll just say a little
I'm
word.
just going to come down and say hello.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you, and please help to expose the organ harvesting.
There's so many things to cover, but I thank you. I apologize. I'm running back. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Co-Chair Senator Rubio. The hearing will now reconvene. Let me just ask a few questions, and again, your testimonies have been absolutely stellar and hopefully motivating, not just to the Congress and to the press and free peoples everywhere, but to the President and to the administration as well. You know, when Pastor Fu says that in the past 2 years, human rights and the rule of law in China have rapidly deteriorated, the number of dissidents taken into police custody, arrested, and convicted since Xi took power has exceeded the total number that occurred during the 10-year reign of President Hu Jintao and President Wen. That is, I mean, that ought to be in headlines across the world, that the race to the bottom with North Korea is unprecedented. It has shades, if not, it's, you know, as you pointed out, Chairman Mao Jr., there's an emulation here of the extraordinary excesses of Chairman Mao. and the depravity, the cruelty that was visited. As you said, Mr. Gyatso, about the meeting with the Dalai Lama and Chairman Mao, that the answer back was that religion is poison. What the government is doing to its own people is poison. And we fail in capitals around the world, including this one, to recognize the insatiable appetite for depravity and cruelty by the guards right up until to the highest levels of this government in Beijing to hurt people, to find very specific ways, whether it be ensuring that fasts are broken, Ramadan is not followed, public drinking of water and taking of food in order to humiliate. Of course, the genocide being committed against the Tibetans, which is ongoing and pervasive. The relentless attempt to not just persecute, but to eradicate religion. And I think that's the track and spiritual belief and exercises that this current Xi Jinping is on. The evidence is overwhelming. And my first question, and I think the point is, and Mrs. Rubio Kadir certainly has dealt with this with her own family as well. The Senator asked a very, I think, important question about not just the incarcerated and persecuted dissident or religious believer or Falun Gong practitioner, but also the whole family goes to jail, not just in China, but everywhere else where members of the family and the extended family reside. We know that with Chen Quanzhen, who Bob Fu worked tirelessly to free and to get out of, and his wife and family out of Beijing. We're waiting for his nephew to be released. You might want to speak to that. But they always find other people to take actions against. I remember being in Hungary not so long ago, and a member of our embassy there made a very serious faux pas when they were somehow accusing the Hungarian government of having a cozy relationship with China. Who has a cozier relationship with China than President Obama and others in our government, particularly on the economics front? But I said, do you realize that they follow and they send more people to follow, this is to say the Chinese government, in capitals around the world and in cities around the world, when there's more of a diaspora there, because they feel they own you, they own the Chinese people. And if you speak out, there's and Rubio Kadir has dealt with that here as well, where she has been harassed by the Chinese government here, not just there, but here. So I think the point, and maybe some of you might want to build on it, about what this government so cruelly does to the families. They torture the imprisoned, but then they cruelly mistreat the families as well, trying to do what they're doing or trying to do to you, with your dad saying to back off on human rights. So the whole family goes to jail. And I think that's underappreciated by policymakers everywhere. I would say on the Muslim, and you might want to respond to all that, but I say on the persecution of the Muslims, I don't know any other country in the world where Muslims are persecuted the way the Uyghurs are in the People's Republic of China. Yet China sits as a member of good standing on the Human Rights Council, on the Security Council of the UN, and on many other prestigious seats there. I plan on taking this testimony, which, again, I think every member of Congress needs to read, and we will get it out to the members, House and Senate. Hopefully the press will report accurately, I believe they will, as to what they've heard today, but also to Prince Zayed. He's the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I've worked with him on human trafficking issues in the past. He runs a large UN bureaucracy of human rights personnel, and he is a Muslim. He should be speaking out every day of the week, generally on all the persecution in China. But if he can't show solidarity with the Uyghurs, that would be a very serious flaw on his part. So we will convey this record to him, especially the urgency that it's worse now than it was a year ago, 2 years ago, and it's in, like I said, a race. China is in a race to the bottom with the North Korea. If you might want to respond to any of that, I would appreciate it. And that is an opener. So,
yeah.
And you also, Pastor Fu, we're going to talk about your recommendations, if you would include them as well.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Chairman Smith, about the cruelty, the increasing cruelty toward the family members. The family members oftentimes has become hostages. I have received multiple messages from these human rights lawyers even before they were arrested. And of course, the example of Gao Zhisheng is another example, whose daughter was just attacked, and the wife was being beaten up. In front of on the street. And I remember when I spoke up in 2002 after we came to the U.S., and then my 70-year-old father was taken into the police station later on. After I rescued him out of China, I learned he was beaten up with a big stake and basically tried to send a signal to silence my voice here. I mean, the latest example, of course, you know that Major Yan Xing, who's the army chaplain, who should be a hero, and who was one of the students' leaders in the students' democracy movement. A close friend of mine, we always pray together over the phone, and a human rights campaigner too. He requests to even visit his ill mother initially. Remember, you also tried to intervene, and a number of members of other Congress, a member of Congress write letters, try to really do a private diplomacy for just a simply humanitarian ground. And Major Yan Xing's mom was basically was holding the last breath, waiting for her son to go back just to say farewell. And this Chinese embassy and consulate reject his visa application, and until really, his mom even died last week, and he still, was not granted a visa. So this is shows the cruelty. Of course, my friend, Yang Jianli, who spent 5 years in prison for just, speaking up and traveling in China, meeting with other dissidents. And I think given the kind of the deteriorating situation, one of the concrete recommendations I would urge you and Senator Rubio to really strongly pushing is to urge the Obama administration to reconsider its invitation to President Xi Jinping to visit the United States in September. And this is not the environment, for him to get a red carpet welcome. And he is not welcomed by the American people. And he may be welcomed by some politicians or, who care nothing but economic interest and who really value nothing but their purse. And this visit by Xi Jinping in September should be either be cancelled, postponed, or at least preconditioned on the release of those prisoners of conscience, some prominent one in the China Free China 18 list. All those prominent human rights activists, journalists like Gao Yu, Pu Zhiqiang, Guo Yushan, and Ilham Tahti, those are the peaceful citizens, the conscience of China. And with them in the dark cell of the Chinese prison, I don't see there's any good reason to justify a state visit, a welcome to Xi Jinping this September. So this is one of my concrete recommendations.
Rahmet, Smith efendim. Xitay hükümeti bizning Uyg'urlarni yalğız bu vatanning ichidagilarni emas, vatanning teshig'i chiqqanlardi. Masalan, mening bir oilamda 2 balam 1 yil, birisi 9 yil, birisi 7 yil hech qanday gunohsiz butun yoshlik bahori shu turmining ichida o'tib ketdi.
Thank you, Mr. Smith, for the question. In the case of the Uyghurs, the Chinese government not only target the Uyghur activists in East Turkestan, but also those Uyghurs who have fled outside of the country, especially target their family members. In my case, as you know, it's very well known that 2 of my sons were sentenced by the Chinese authorities because of my human rights advocacy. One son was sentenced to 7 years, another to 9, basically by guilty of association.
Ular sırtı bolğan bilen hazır 24 adam nəvirlərimdən tatıb çəvirlərimgəcə heç qandaq hərəkət qılamay nazaret astida sırtda bir turmud yaşagandək yaşayatıdı.
Although both of my sons are out of prison now, serve their terms, but I do have 24 other relatives, including children and grandchildren. They are not in prison, but it's not any different than they're in prison, actually. They're all under surveillance, strict government control, so they are in an open prison.
Ularning barlıq iqtisadi mal mülki to'ltib qo'yildi.
All their financial means are frozen and confiscated by the government.
Hatta məktəbdən çıxqandan keyin bularning ishqi oliy məktəb bitkizganlarning qar tizimlik odamlar deb ishqa o'rlashtirish huquqi yo'q.
And some of my grandchildren who graduate from universities, they're also blacklisted. They could never get a job anywhere.
Bunun ahvali shundaq ig'ir. Endi hozir Shuhrat ushu radio free ayjadiki radio free ayjad ash ras axborotni berganligi uchun uning 3-1 tuqqinni turmaga oldi.
And another example is a reporter, Uyghur reporter at Radio Free Asia. His name is Shuhrat Wushur, and because of his reporting of Chinese government human rights violations, 3 of his siblings were detained by the Chinese authorities.
Hiç qandaq günahı yo'q tuqqanlarninki, endi mushundaq besim yalğız bu 2 oilali emas, bütün chet elga qechib chiqqan, odatda hech ish qilmaganlarning oila tabobatlarini tutib turmaga tashlash va chet eldagi tuqqanlarni sen josuslik qilmasang, bizga ishlamasang, tuqqanlaringni turmaga tashlaymiz degan tahdid ostida yashayotdi.
And these are obviously just 2 cases, but for all the Uyghurs who have fled Chinese persecution and have become active overseas, their relatives and family members are harassed, and some family members, the government use them to pressure their relatives outside of the country to spy on their own communities on behalf of the Chinese authorities.
Endi Uyghur xalqining dini etiqadidan foydalanib turib Xitoy hukumati mush dunyo vaziyatidan foydalanib Uyghur xalqini nəhayət qattiq bastırıb, nəhayət keng ko'lamda tutqun qilib, keng ko'lamda o'ltagan bo'lg'achqa Uyghur xalqining vatanda turish imkoniyati yo'q. Malayziyaga, Taylandga, Turkiyaga 10 minglarcha odam bola vaqillari bilan uy mulkini tashlab qochib chiqdi.
And due to the increasing religious repression of the Chinese authorities against the Uyghur people and targeting Uyghur people's faith in Islam, which is demonized by the Chinese authorities. And for many religious Uyghurs, it's almost impossible to live a normal life in our homeland of East Turkestan. As a result, many have sold whatever they could sell and fled to Southeastern Asian countries of Thailand, Malaysia, and hoping to reach to Turkey.
Bular
In
aş
recent years.
kichkina emi batqan ballardan tatib, aş qeyri momaylag'icha uy mulkini tashlab qochib chiqdi.
And we have seen men, women, children, and even pregnant women leaving our homeland.
Bu qitim Tayland
Yes.
turmusiga tashlanganlar 2 yil aş vatandan aş hayotini qutqizish uchun chiqqanlar jinoyatchidek 2 yil Tayland turmusida yetib, Tayland turmusi qaytarib etmaymiz deb qo'yib, buni Xitoy 109 odamimizni majburiy urib so'qib harbiy aeroplanda olib ketdi.
And we had several hundred Uyghurs detained by the Thai authorities for the past 2 years. And recently, 109 of them were forcibly deported by the Thai government to China. We have seen the photos of the deportation. They were treated like criminals by the Chinese authorities and taken away to.
Hazır endi 60 adam Tayland turmusida qoldi. Bularning urug' tuqqanlarining hammasini tutqun qilib turmuga tashlab bo'pti. Qaytib kelmasa, tuqqanlaring sizlarni chiqarmaymiz deb.
We now have nearly 60 Uyghurs still in Thai detention centers. We deeply fear for their future should any deportation happen. But we already know the Chinese government is harassing the relatives of the nearly 60 Uyghurs detained in Thailand. pressuring the family members basically to pressure the Uyghurs detained in Thailand to return to China.
Xitay hökuməti məyli bu Falun Gong olsun, məyli Xristiyan olsun, məyli Tibet olsun, bu həmmimizə selivatqan zulmü çəkidi işib getdi. Bu qitim Taylanddakı adamlarning qaytirib akatgan adamlarning hayotidan ansiraymiz Uyghur xalqi, ham shu qilib qolganlarning qaytib chiqishidan yana ansiraymiz.
So the situation, of course, is very similar across the board, whether one is a Falun Gong member, one is a Chinese Christian, one is a Tibetan under Chinese rule, and the Chinese government's aggressive persecution of the activists both inside and outside China is extremely severe. But at the moment, we are deeply concerned with the fate of the 109 Uyghurs deported to China. We also hope the rest of the Uyghurs in Thai detention would not be deported.
Okay.
Thank you.
I would like to talk about some of my colleagues' experience. These are very courageous people that I work with on independent film and television projects that expose human rights abuse there in China. NTD TV president Shao Jiuwang, his brother was harassed in China because he practiced Falun Gong and also speak about the abuse that are happening. A TV producer, a film producer actually, I worked with last summer, Liang Li. He just made a film about the organ harvesting that's happening in China, and his family member has been constantly threatened by the security force. These are people that are working in the media, help to bring light to this kind of abuse. I think if every Chinese can speak up, and if the government can protect these citizens and speak up and let the government, the Chinese government, know that when they do such things, they will have a reputational cost, then perhaps they will respect our borders a bit more. Thank you.
We're joined by Commissioner Pittenger, a good friend and colleague, and also a religious freedom human rights activist and a very, very strong believer and an inspiration to me. Mr. Pittenger.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, for your wonderful leadership in the plight of religious freedom for people throughout the world. We've met some 30 years ago, and I've always been grateful for your big heart and compassion toward these important issues. I've been engaged in this since my involvement with Campus Crusade for Christ back in the 1970s. It's 10 years. I was assistant to Dr. Bill Bright, president of that organization, and we quietly worked through various groups in various parts of the world in the plight of those who are suppressed for their faith, and as well as working and traveling in the former Soviet Union back in the 1980s with Congressman Frank Wolf and David Amos, a member of Parliament. We went there for behalf of those seeking freedoms of conscience and religious liberties. So I'm deeply committed to these issues, and I want to express my heartfelt solidarity with each of you. I know that many gathered here last week for the Falun Gong demonstration and for the rights to practice their beliefs. And we stand with all people of all faiths for that right and that privilege. It's a God-honored commitment that I believe that all people should have. So thank you for having this hearing, Mr. Chairman, and I look forward to continued discussion, dialogue with you.
Thank you very much. Before we conclude, if there's any other points that any of you would like to make, I do want to, you know, China is a signatory to the Genocide Convention, and they have, in my opinion, and they ought to be held to account for it, committed multiple acts of genocide and do so to this very day. There's the gender side issue where the females are being slaughtered through the one child per couple policy. They pass laws that are absolutely ineffective and unenforced because it brings the numbers down. And we know that as part of population control that came right out of Washington, the Planned Parenthood and other organizations in the 60s, the idea of destroying the baby girl, the girl child in utero, is an effective means of reducing your population, because not only do you kill the baby in the womb, who happens to be a girl, you also kill the chances of that girl being a mother when she's 20 and 25 and 30. On religious grounds, the Tibetans, there's no clear example ever of a genocide. I've read the Dalai Lama's book, and when he talked about the Han majority replacement, systematically displacing indigenous Tibetans, and then the multiple systematic attacks against Tibetan Buddhists, clear example of genocide. Same goes, I believe, with the Uyghurs, less visible to many people. It ought to be, but it's not. But it is another genocide, a systematic destruction of a people in whole or in part. I mean, it fits the definition. Christians, they've tried to manage it for years after trying to completely eliminate, as Mao Zedong told the Dalai Lama, the poison of religion. Then they looked to manage it, and I think now they're reverting back to a destructive mode or modality. And the Falun Gong, it is inexplicable what the fear is there. It ought to be, I mean, people of faith form wonderful citizens who are law-abiding. And the Falun Gong have shown no tendency other than to be, very, very good people with good principles. And yet the Chinese government has been on a tear to slaughter, kill, and as you pointed out, Ms. Lin, the organ harvesting issue is something we're really looking aggressively into, because that is another major fundamental human rights abuse, to kill someone to procure their organs. I held hearings 20 years ago, and we had a man who actually was a police officer who left, got asylum here, and he got asylum in part because he came and appeared before our hearing, but he brought documentary evidence showing that they were exterminating, killing, executing prisoners, but not totally until they got the preferred body organ for transplant. And he gave us a tremendous amount of documentation on that. And to think that kind of horror, which is Nazi-like, continues today against Falun Gong and perhaps others, is an atrocity that can't go unaddressed. Bob Fu, Pastor Fu, said that Xi Jinping's invitation, and who knows if it's going to be a full White House dinner with the red carpet. We've had, you enable evil, in my opinion, when you bring people in and give them a public relations opportunity back home that is second to none. I believe in meeting with people that you profoundly disagree with. I met with Bashir, who they did the genocide against the people of Darfur and South Sudan. Met with him for well over an hour. Argued with him, but we don't do the arguing part. We meet, we toast, and we make nice. Diplomacy ought to be heavily imbued with truth and reality. And unfortunately, and the one that got me even more than when President Obama had who here was when Zhou Tian came in, the defense minister of China, who was the operational commander for Tiananmen Square massacre. He should have been sent to The Hague for crimes against humanity. Instead, he was given a 19-gun salute by President Bill Clinton. I'll never forget it. I put together a hearing that day. Some of you were here. And we bore witness to the fact 2 days after Zhou Tian said nobody died at Tiananmen Square. Back home, because I read People's Daily, the English version, it was like Zhou Tian takes Washington by storm. We need our government. We need the president. He can do it as diplomatically as he wants, but to have some red lines about these human rights abuses that, as you have pointed out, all of you have pointed out, has gone from bad to worse. And again, we're going to give this hearing over to the White House. Hopefully they'll look at it. Hopefully they won't throw it into the circular file. But the president himself and Biden himself, if you're going to get these positions, if you aspire to be president, you better be president for all the people, Americans, and as well as for people who are struggling under the tyranny of a dictatorship as they are in Beijing and throughout China. So if you want to make any final comments, or Mr. Pincher, if you would want to conclude on anything, thank you for your speaking truth to power with risks to yourselves and your loved ones when you do it. And I just want to say how grateful we are. We will give this to Prince Zayed. I'll get a copy to Bang Ki-moon, and hopefully I'll physically put it in his hands and ask him to read it, because China gets a pass on human rights. They have been for far too long, and now that they are in a race to the bottom, I'll say for the third time, with North Korea for abuses against their own citizens, it's about time that that the United Nations found its voice. Pastor Fu.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Once again, I just want to have these, the rest of the 4 specific recommendations to the State Department specifically. And thank you, Congressman Pittenger, for your leadership too. And I mean, as you just mentioned, these family members, I mean, we actually even on our midst today, there is a petitioner from Heilongjiang province, I mean, who, Miss Ma Ying-chin, she was abused and tortured even for just simply making peaceful petition for her property. Her whole factory were arbitrarily confiscated, and with all her wealth were gone. And I think the U.S. State Department should strongly consider posting an officer at the U.S. Embassy in China with the sole responsibility of monitoring and reporting on religious freedom and related human rights abuses within China, including in the areas of Tibet and Xinjiang. I think that I also recommend the State Department's Office of International Religious Freedom and the Commission on International Religious Freedom to each year to at least request to visit China. When was the last time each of the the office and agency have visited China? I think it's already years that there's no visit, or one request to visit. The former ambassador large was even denied a visa, and but we did not hold any protest on even denying a president-appointed ambassador at large. That's a shame. And the third recommendation I would recommend is the U.S. State Department should make an official public statement condemning this forced demolition of churches and crosses in Zhejiang and other areas of China. So far, neither the Secretary Kerry or the spokesperson have issued even a public statement condemning this large, brutal, shameful campaign. And the fourth and last one is the State Department should raise publicly and at all levels of exchange with the Chinese government the cases of prisoner of conscience, including the China 18 and others. And I know you had led the campaign to urge President Obama to meet with these daughters of the prisoner of conscience multiple times. I think if the excuse not to meeting with these family members in China is, it could pose a danger or potential threat. But how about here in the United States? There's no threat, to meet with the family members. So these are the recommendations. I hope the State Department and our embassy can really actively engage with those family members, those affected by this the forced removal of crosses and demolition of churches. The pastors, they can go and visit them and to meet with them and to really know about the situation and take concrete steps. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, one final remark, Mr. Chairman. There are 50 Falun Gong practitioners who has been recently denied refugee status in South Korea and are ready to be deported back to China to face those inhumane violations. I admire your commitment to human rights, but not every government is like that. And I think we now face a choice. Every one of us who are outside and inside China, we can choose to be silent and conform to this kind of violation, or we can use our liberty to advocate for those whose liberty has been deprived. Yeah, thank you very much.
On those 50, we will look into it and see if it would be appropriate. It probably will, but we'll have to vet do a quick vetting of it. I mean, the whole issue of refoulement is that you don't send somebody back where there's a well-founded fear of persecution. You can count on each of those people, I think, going back to persecution, not even the fear of it. We have had ongoing arguments with the UNHCR and then a number of host governments who continually do this, send Falun Gong and others back to near certainty, either incarceration, certainly harassment, and we could contact not only the government of South Korea, but also the High Commissioner for Refugees. So we'll follow up on that right after this hearing. Ms. Kadir, Mr.
If I may, just one final. In terms of finding some sort of a resolution and a solution to the situation inside Tibet, and one thing that is clear for Tibetans in exile, and I think for messages coming out of Tibet, there is support for the Dalai Lama's proposal made to the Chinese government many years ago of finding an amicable solution for Tibetans to exist within the Chinese state with autonomy over their culture, education, etc., which I think a possible solution within this Dalai Lama's lifetime would be for the United States and other ally countries that may see the wisdom of this solution, this proposal, to support it more openly and to help introduce education for the Chinese people to understand the content of that proposal, so that they can see that a viable solution is not being properly addressed by the Chinese government. Because after the passing of this Dalai Lama, I believe Tibet will enter a much more bleaker situation. Yeah, thank you, Your Honor.
Hazır Xitay hükümeti muşu dinge takap durup Uygurlarını Yekende, Qashqada, Xotanda, şəhər-şəhərdə xalığanca minbinlarga və saqçılarga, adətdəki bir əskərlərə Uyğurlarını etib öldürüş hüququnu tövəngə berib etib, xalığanca etib öldürüb atıdı.
And in the case of Uyghurs, our biggest concern is the extrajudicial killing of Uyghurs by the Chinese security forces, especially in areas of predominantly Uyghur areas of Yarkand, Kashgar, and Khotan.
Hatta Aksu ürümçilərdimi? Bularını etib öldürüb berib, bular bıçaq götərdi, atdıq deydi, qoldan bir bıçaq çıxdı deydi. Bulardan hər atqa vaxtıda balları, apisi, ailesi bilən 10-dan, 15-dan, 20-dan, hatta yüzlərcə adamlarını aşına atdı.
And it's also extended sometimes to Aksu and Urumqi areas. In most cases, we see Chinese security forces shoot and kill these Uyghurs, then just blame them. We do see sometimes family members, women, and children were involved, especially in police raids into the homes of the Uyghurs.
Yaxında muşu tönögün bugün 3 gün boldu. Aksuda bir Xanzu ayalını kiçik balası bilen qançı ögünüşk ektipağa yerdə Uyghur oxşaydı dep axtırdığı yerdən ötüb getkenge etib öldürdü.
Just 2 days ago, the Chinese security forces in the city of Aksu shot and killed a Chinese woman with her child. She was taking her daughter to a piano lesson. Then, for some reason, she may not have stopped at the particular checkpoint. We believe she was mistaken as a Uyghur and shot and killed. This is like the first time Han Chinese was extrajudicially killed in our homeland.
Endi onun yolduşunun degen gibi, sizler nime üçün guman qılsаңlar berip tutmaysızlar. Nime üçün unda etip öldürsizlər kiçik balının mölçerligen eken, sizlerinin vazifаңlar zat adam öldürüş bu dese biz Uyghur oxşaydı deptimiz depti.
And her husband obviously was furious with the extrajudicial killing of her wife in the presence of the daughter. So he basically asked, why didn't you stop her? Or if you were suspicious, why didn't you shoot like the tires? Why did you shoot inside of the car and killing my wife? Is it your job just to shoot and kill, not to stop people? So
Biz Uyghur okşaydı deptik.
And they said, we thought maybe some Uyghurs or some suspects. So,
Demek Uygurlar muşunda kattık bir tutkun kılış, öldürüş astıda turvatıdı hem de. Men talibim hem de State Department, Kongresslar State Department'a kattık bir beş meselesi. Meyli Falun Gong olsun, meyli Tibet olsun, meyli Uygur olsun, meyli Hristiyan olsun, muşunda kanunsuz adam öldürüş meselesiga alaydı bir grup teşkillep, davamlılık aşının Xitay hükümetinin muşu meselesiga çoğurak bir arlaşsa deydiğen, Amerika hükümeti kattıqırak bir arlaşsa deydiğen bir talibim var.
so my hope is both the administration and U.S. Congress, especially State Department, could raise the issue urgently, the extrajudicial nature of Chinese security forces killing of not just Uyghurs, because they test with Uyghurs, then they extend it to Tibet, to Falun Gong, to Chinese Christians. Usually this is the way to go. So I hope the U.S. Congress and administration will pay particular attention to the extrajudicial killings. Thank you.
Any concluding comments? Thank you so much. You are true heroes.